in front of the senior command room, actually.
Okay.
Just because they don't have space in math, so they put people.
It's literally stuck in chemistry because there's nowhere in math.
Okay. Right. So Andy te donnera le timing. Oui, sorry.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming back after lunch. I hope you all get replenished and full of energy for this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce Peter Hillier. We used to share an office at King's, and then he got kidnapped by Imperial, where he holds Sir Henry Wellcome Fellowship, and he's going to talk to us about exciting recent developments about avatars. Yeah.
Cheers. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about basically kind of describe the program of research that we're doing at the moment, and I'll build up to discussing what we're calling the Connectome Avatar, which is a kind of exciting project that we started working on about a year ago, and I spoke to both Paul and LD about it around the time, and they thought it'd be a fun thing to share. So I'll show you a bit of the kind of background and some kind of preliminary work that we've done with it, and give you a kind of good idea of the sorts of things that we're trying to play with. I'll start with a slight health warning. I am a psychologist by background, and I'm about to say some words that might slightly offend statistical physicists in the room, but I'm just going to crack on and do it anyway, in the hope that everyone is happy in the end. Cool. So the kind of background to why we're doing quite a lot of our work is there are increasingly kind of complicated different ways of looking at the brain, and the three kind of ways that are consistently used are the analysis of kind of structural connectivity in the brain, and this can be at the kind of local level where we're talking about small populations of neurons, so excitatory and inhibitory neurons within the cortex, and these kind of macroscopic structural connectivity approaches, such as the sort of DSI and diffusion approaches that we talked a little bit about this morning. And alongside these approaches, the kind of network level type ideas of function. So this kind of cartoon that I've got in the top right hand corner is a kind of is sort of measure of functional connectivity over time. So this is recurrent brain networks that oscillate with each other in a kind of awake, healthy 32-year-old male subject. And alongside that, we have the kind of, sticking an electrode in it, or the MEG/EEG sort of approach, the electrophysiological approaches to looking at function. And then tying somewhere between these two measures are the kind of cognitive explanations for these kind of these networks, the kind of cognitive synthesis that we place upon functional and structural networks. So thinking about the functional networks, I mean, there's a tendency for the current literature to describe these as kind of temporally static sort of networks that kind of appear over time. And this characterization at the bottom is a collection of the kind of canonical connectivity networks that appear from doing an independent component analysis on resting state functional connectivity. And usually the kind of the time courses that are associated with these functional connectivity networks then get correlated with some form of task-related activities. This matrix on the right-hand side shows some of the different kind of cognitive tasks that are associated with each of these different networks on the right-hand side. So we have this kind of temporal concurrent relationship between kind of functional activity that occurs or cognitive tasks and the emergence of these individual networks. However, as you can appreciate from the kind of animation at the very top, it's slightly more complicated than this. These networks appear both at rest and during task, and have a kind of very complicated temporal dynamic that occurs with them. At the same time, our kind of approaches to looking at structural activity, structural networks within the brain have allowed us to produce these really rather discrete and beautiful wiring diagrams of the brain. So this is diffusion tensor imaging in actually the same adult that we did the functional imaging in. which shows these kind of really interesting wiring diagrams that will allow us to build these kind of large-scale structural networks. And by analysing these kind of diffusion tensor imaging approaches, we can come up with interesting metrics that relates to damage within these networks. So, for example, normal white matter and normal kind of connectivity between regions is characterized by this kind of high anisotropy, so this kind of constraint of water within tightly packed axonal bundles. Whereas in the cortex, water is much freer to diffuse because of the lack of cell membranes and the lack of myelination around bundles. And in doing so, we can kind of directly measure kind of structural damage. So when these kind of these white matter bundles break down, and we can use this as a kind of index of network dysfunction. And in doing so, a lot of the work that we have previously done has taken this idea of structural connectivity and looked at how this kind of structural disconnection relates to kind of cognitive outcomes. So we're looking at this kind of link between structure now and cognitive function. And one of our earliest papers showed this kind of very strong relationship between the structure of white matter projections from the fornix and executive function within the brain. So this is kind of a measure of this kind of FA value within the fornix and a test called the people test, and it's a kind of measure of memory and executive function. And we can also use these kind of structural measures to directly predict measures of cognitive outcome. So here we've got a very simple kind of machine learning approach where we have connected kind of measures of task switching, information processing speed with white matter deformation following traumatic brain injury. And of course these are cognitive domains that we in the clinic see very strongly is broken down in patients following blunt head trauma. Equally, moving back to the idea of thinking about functional networks, we have shown in our previous work that the kind of dichotomy, this kind of balance between two very, very common functional networks, this kind of salience network shown in red on the right-hand side, and the default mode network, which is this kind of resting state, kind of freewheeling idea of a network, breaks down and correlates very, very strongly with kind of dysfunction within a kind of a tract that links the insula with the posterior cingulate. And these kind of measures give us this idea of this kind of direct linkage between kind of functional networks and structural networks. However, I'd quite like to build a kind of straw man between the kind of interesting links that we've kind of developed there. So we've got some ideas of kind of structural relationships to functional activity, some kind of relationship between structure and cognition. But our kind of cognitive models will say something like, okay, the structure of the inferior parietal lobe leads to good function within that region of the brain, and that therefore leads to attention. And in patients, we would say, okay, so I've damaged that region, and therefore I've got less function that occurs in that region, and therefore that leads to cognitive neglect. And these are all kind of very interesting kind of box and arrow diagrams, but these descriptions feel ever so slightly hollow to a certain extent, because I don't really know anything about these kind of cognitive constructs other than a thing breaks. Where do we move from here forward from pointing a region of the brain and saying that region is cognition? What we really want to ask is, why does that region allow the brain to do a certain thing? What is it about that structural connectivity that allows the brain to have a certain dynamic or a certain functional thing? So we end up in this kind of black box situation where we have a link between structural and functional connectivity. There's something somewhere in between that we're not entirely sure what is. And our view is that there's some kind of dynamic thing that's hidden somewhere in between. It's not just about how things are connected to each other, but it's about how that information is integrated between those two regions. And somewhere within here is this idea of cognitive context. And in reality, cognitive context changes dramatically over time and changes dynamically over time. So it makes sense for this kind of cognitive context to be encoded within this dynamics layer, as opposed to a kind of large-scale reorganization of a structural network over time. So our question really is kind of what's happening in this location? How does this therefore relate to behavior? And some of the approaches that we've been using to think about this have involved, and this is the first time I'm going to start slightly insulting physicists within the room, involve a kind of, we're thinking about some of these things in a kind of theoretical framework of neural dynamics to kind of relate dynamics through structure to behavior. And one of the very simple approaches we've used is this idea of synchrony, and this is the idea that simultaneous activity across multiple regions can become highly synchronized over time. And this kind of cartoon here shows that kind of idea in quite simple terms. Equally, you could have modes of activity that are highly asynchronous over time as well. Another measure that we've been particularly interested in is metastability. And when we describe metastability to our postgrad students, we tend to use this clip from Terminator 2, simply because we've got the T2000 here, which is appearing in and out of many different states. At this point, he appears to come out and look like a police officer. In other parts of the film, he's a truck. There's another bit where he shoots him with a bullet. I think that's about to happen here, and he explodes into all sorts of different bits and pieces. But he exists as a kind of dynamical system that moves between transient attractor states as is required by the context that he's in. And our postulate here is that the brain itself maintains this kind of metastable dynamic because it produces this kind of system where the cognitive context directly relates to the kind of functional dynamics that you see over time and the kind of stable states that emerge across time. And hidden in this is this interesting concept about criticality, which has become particularly trendy in thinking about neuroscience in the last couple of years. And these kind of simulations, which I've pinched from Beggs and Penn's from 2011, show a very interesting property about the kind of critical regime, and this is this idea that the dynamics of a system as a result of changing one particular order parameter undergo this kind of phase transition, this kind of second order phase transition between highly ordered dynamics on one side and highly disordered dynamics on the other side, and pass through this critical point. And at this critical point, as a product of changing this order parameter, the kind of correlation structure of the system displays some very interesting properties which are reminiscent of communication, particularly. So in the kind of cognitive sense, when we talk about two regions being connected functionally or communicating functionally, we talk a lot about two regions being correlated with each other. So if two regions are correlated, they're talking to each other, they can share information, and so on and so forth. But across an entire system, a system that's entirely correlated in and of itself doesn't actually contain an awful lot of information. The ability to encode a lot of information is very, very slim within that system, and certainly the ability of that system to change its information content over time is very, very small. So within these examples here. On the left-hand side, you've got this kind of highly correlated system, so you could say quite a lot of communication could occur in that, but there's not much scope for a message to be encoded. Whereas in the right-hand side, there's a lot of dynamic activity, so a lot of information can be encoded in that system, but there's very little scope for it to move around the system. But at this critical state, you kind of have this balance between both of these two systems, where you obviously have the ability for information to pass across the system, but you can also encode complex messages within it as well. So we've been thinking quite a lot about this kind of critical state as a kind of model for the kind of healthy brain. And one of the approaches that we have used to look at these kind of ideas is this kind of computational modelling approach. And one of the earliest models that we started to look at was this chromosome model, where generally speaking we encode the kind of mean field dynamics at a bunch of different nodes in the brain as these kind of oscillator systems, these kind of rotating oscillators. And these guys are connected up to each other based on the kind of the structural connectomes that we were talking about earlier, so the kind of human connectomes based on DSI. And I've got my slides ever so slightly out of order here, I'm afraid. Sorry. That's what I've got. So the connections that you can see here, these kind of connections that you can see in green on the top-hand side, encode both delay and strength of connectivity from the DSI data. And these kind of measures of synchronization and metastability we can infer from these networks by looking at the phase difference between each of the regions. I think my animation here is in the wrong order again. Nope, it's vanished entirely. Okay, so this probably doesn't make much sense because that last slide didn't work. Okay, so what we've got here is I've parameterized this model in two ways. So I'm looking at the kind of coupling and I'm looking at the mean delay of that computational model. So I can make the coupling stronger or I could make it weaker. And then I can analyze the kind of overall dynamics of that computational model. Which I've plotted out in these points here. So if I take a region with relatively high coupling, so at the very top of this graph, you can see that the system becomes very synchronized very quickly. And if I take a region at the bottom, I get this kind of highly random dynamic that occurs on the right-hand side. And as you wander between these two things, you undergo this kind of phase transition, which produces this kind of critical dynamic which sits in the middle. So we've got this kind of relationship between slightly random chaotic dynamics, but if you also look at that video long enough, you'll see some degrees of patterns that emerge within that system, so some things that flash together and some things that don't flash together. And one of the ways that we've been looking at how these models actually relate to the brain is to say, okay, so we've taken structural connectivity from in this case, this is the data sets that Patrick Hagman has published. And we produce this kind of computational model. And we can then test the kind of functional connectivity of our computational model against empirical measures of functional connectivity. And I can do that in a pairwise fashion simply by simulating a functional connectivity matrix and looking at its equivalent empirical FC matrix. Or alternatively, we also produce this approach that uses independent component analysis in order to break down the kind of functional networks that occur within our system and produce a similar kind of parameter space plot for the power of these connectivity matrices and the power of our computational model to predict the empirical reality. And when we do that, we see these are the kind of results that we see. On the left-hand side, there is a kind of measure of the functional connectivity fit when we just use a pairwise approach. And on the right-hand side, again, we have the kind of correlation coefficients between using our kind of more nonlinear independent component analysis approach to comparing the kind of dynamics of these computational models to the empirical data. And what you can see is kind of as you wander into this kind of phase transition area within the kind of computational model, as you scale up connectivity, you drastically increase the kind of fit of the computational model to empirical networks. So here is just a kind of example of those empirical networks against the computational model. along the bottom here. And you can see there are some slight differences between the empirical networks and the model networks, but on the whole, there's quite a lot of similarity between those two sets of networks. And our interpretation of this, to a certain extent, is to say that, as you walk into this kind of critical dynamic, and here again is the simulation that goes with a region with a mean delay of around about 10 milliseconds, when you have this kind of critical or metastable type behavior within the system, that's the point where these simulations begin to give you similar kinds of connectivity networks, as you see in the empirical data. But one of the things that we have been concerned about in terms of thinking about critical systems is that many of the examples of critical systems that you see in nature are very, very highly tuned for the conditions that they sit in. And this gives them a certain degree of fragility, which is very different to the way that the brain is interacting. So the brain itself is kind of dynamically occurring in the real world. And you can see, obviously, there's functional activity that is occurring over time. But equally, the world around it is changing. The overall pattern of day-to-day interactions is different, and suddenly there might be some kind of stimulus that suddenly appears in the real world, which entirely changes the kind of input-output structure of your system. And with many kind of computational models of this approach, you would find that the change of the kind of external conditions would lead to either fully synchronized or chaotic dynamics. I mean, pushing it away from this kind of critical attractor state. So in many ways, whilst we think that communication and the kind of the physical properties that critical systems provide to a brain are quite useful and have lots of properties for encoding information hidden within them, there are certain problems with the way that we interact with the world that's inherent within this model. So one of the ways that we thought maybe this could work is there might be some other way of kind of self-organizing the system. What we're interested in is looking at mechanisms which the brain can use in order to self-organize its critical dynamics, whilst also at the same time maintaining that kind of flexibility that we think is very useful. And one of the approaches that we took as an extension of some of the work done by Jack Cowan a couple of years ago is to define a collection of kind of excitatory pools at each individual region of our brain. In this case, it's a 66 node system that has its own kind of external inputs and self connections inherent within them. And Jack's work really showed that homeostasis and kind of local plasticity in nodes can be mediated by the kind of balance between excitation and inhibition. And this kind of excitation inhibition mediated homeostasis within a kind of putative network can induce these kind of critical dynamics within the system. So it can take a nicely balanced set of excitatory pools and produce a kind of critical dynamic within it, despite changes to the external world. So these kind of plasticity ideas can adapt the network that is occurring, or the dynamics at each individual node, in order to account for changes in the external world. So we also wired up a collection of inhibitory pools to this system. So this is very similar to the classic Wilson-Cowan model, but with a slight difference that we allow the local inhibition within the system to be tuned according to changes in the external world. So we use this kind of very basic balancing paradigm where we say that our excitation and our inhibition have to balance to a certain target as a product of everything that changes in the external world. So if I put more input into the external inputs of these nodes, it will simply change the local inhibitory weights in order to balance that system out and lead us to this kind of critical situation. And of course, we can do the same trick in terms of validation. But we also, in this sense, added an assessment of a kind of critical dynamic that was occurring within the system. So one of the interesting things about critical systems is they show this kind of power law relationship within the correlation structure. And we simply produce a measure that gives us an idea of how close we are to that power law-like structure within the correlations of our system, which we call kappa. And simply put, when kappa is equal to 1, we have a purely power law style relationship within those dynamics. And when we look at the model where we don't allow this kind of plasticity to occur, what we've got in these graphs is along the bottom, we've got the kind of scaling parameter, so how strongly coupled things are at rest, and on the top, on the left-hand side, we have the amount of environmental noise that we're firing into this model at the same time. And what you can see is there's a kind of very tight area within this parameter space where we, on the right-hand side, get this nice fit to empirical functional connectivity, as we saw with the Chromosome Model. But also there's a very thin band of this parameter system where you get this kind of critical regime. So this system, you could say, is actually very fragile in terms of its maintaining critical dynamics, because you must be within this kind of very balanced location in terms of noise and in terms of internal connectivity in order for this to occur. But as soon as we add this kind of dynamical feedback system, this kind of plasticity system into the equations, we suddenly kind of increase the tendency for the entire parameter space to fit functional connectivity. So we can set this to a kind of set point of criticality simply by manipulating the amount of plasticity that occurs within local nodes. And that not only increases the kind of fit between our computational model and empirical functional connectivity, but also drags this kind of critical dynamic across a kind of whole range of things. So it proves this idea that this kind of plasticity approach can allow us to have external resilience to these computational models that allows them to maintain this critical dynamic. And on the right-hand side, there's a small kind of exploration of exactly what we can do with the parameters of that plasticity manipulation function in order to tune exactly how critical the system is, and so on and so forth. But there's quite a lot more about this in our neuroimage paper last year that's worth having a quick look at. But of course, it's not just the kind of internal dynamics of a system that relates to its own dynamics. And this is one of my more favourite videos of a critical system within nature. And this is, of course, starlings running around in the external world, and their interaction with both each other and the external world kind of denote the kind of dynamic that they occur. So when there's large, wide open spaces, they can produce these kind of really beautiful patterns of synchronized activity that has this kind of random dynamic approach to it as well. So really, their relationship with each other and also the relationship with the entire PACS external world are really actually quite crucial to the dynamic that they present. So we wanted to move further forwards with the kind of computational modeling approaches that we were doing to not only consider kind of random noise or random perturbations to a system, but to really start asking questions about what the quality of the dynamic world that those models find themselves in relates to the kind of dynamics that are occurring. So we've defined actually a very simple computational model, which is much simpler than the Wilson-Cowan model that I described earlier. There's effectively a three-model system where you have, in yellow, a kind of a resting state, so a kind of quiescent state within the neuron, a blue kind of a green kind of active state, and a green kind of inactive state. So it's a very simple kind of cellular automaton, and the passage of activity between these individual states is defined by some very simple probability rules. So the probability of moving between this kind of quiescent state into an active state has a certain probability. We'll just do it randomly. And the inactive state will move back to a quiescent state, and so on and so forth. So we have a kind of very simple local dynamic that's based on the passage between three different things based on probability. So set to run by themselves, these things will just flash a little bit, and you can turn the speed of how they flash up and down just by manipulating these probability functions. And equally, within a network, and again, this is the same connectivity network that we used, that I used in the system at the top of the talk. We have kind of interrelationship between each of these regions, and you can see on the right-hand side there's a kind of threshold that allows incoming activity from all sorts of different nodes within the network to summate and cause quiescent nodes to move into the active state. But alongside that, we've also said, okay, so this kind of, we've got a kind of interesting network that we can tune the kind of connection parts of. But what happens if we place this into a real world? So we defined a very simple kind of actor. So here described as a kind of robot. And we defined several nodes within this system to act as a kind of motor output and kind of visual input to the system. So our robot basically has three commands that it can possibly execute in terms of motor activity. It can go forward, it can go left, and it can go right. And in the top left figure, I've effectively identified two nodes that fully control that behavior. So when they're both switched on, the robot moves forwards. When one of those nodes, which I've defined as left, is switched on, the robot tips to the left. If I turn the right one on, and so on and so forth, it tips to the right. And then equally, I've defined two additional nodes where I'm allowing input to the system to occur. So in my output nodes, simply by being active, those nodes trigger a bit of behavior. In my input nodes, what I've said is if the robot is within two world units in the computational model of an object, those nodes will get switched on. And if the robot runs into a wall, if it physically hits it, I've defined a blue node called the somatosensory node, which allows my robot to respond to a physical jolt to the wall. And this kind of computational model has been used without the kind of the complicated inputs and outputs in some of the work by Eero Hanavici and Dante Chialvo to show that these systems, these kind of very simple models, when they're based on this kind of when they're at a kind of critical transition point, so you can see here this kind of red blob, produce a similar kind of network fit to the kind of network fits that we showed earlier. So these kind of computational models can produce kind of empirical data at this kind of this empirical at this kind of critical set point. So when we run this computational model, what you can see on the left-hand side here is the model itself running in fairly much in real time. So you can see this kind of propagating dynamic that occurs within the system. On the right-hand side, you've got our little robot, who, for reasons that are complicated, we call Ethan, who is running around inside this kind of walled chamber. So at the moment, he's kind of happily kind of freewheeling around just a little bit. And at some point, he'll wander into a wall, and that will increase the amount of activity that is occurring within the system. So, I mean, this simulation goes on for the next 15 minutes, which could be quite fun to watch, but also is a waste of everyone's time. So if you want to have a look at this in slightly more detail, I can run the simulation for you and we can play with it a little bit. And there's all sorts of parameters that you can tweak around to change this behavior. So do grab me afterwards, and I'll be happy to show you this in slightly more detail. But what we can also do with this is we can also manipulate the dynamics that are occurring internally within the model and ask questions about how that changes his interaction with the external world. So not allowing for any plasticity at all, we can build this kind of phase transition within the computational model simply as a product of changing the coupling within the system, as has been shown in the slide a couple before. And what you can see here is there's this kind of straightforward phase transition between the mean activity of the model, and that's what this color plot shows here as you increase this kind of coupling factor. And that has a direct influence on how he relates to the environment that he's sat in. So if you pick kind of the yellow blob on the left-hand side where the coupling is relatively low, he doesn't tend to move around a huge amount. The dynamics that he has are quite random, and as a result, he tends to sort of hang around in the middle of his cell and shift backwards and forwards ever so slightly. There's no real kind of interaction with it within the world. When the activity is very, very high, and the coupling is also very, very high, he has a tendency to kind of randomly walk all the way around the system. So this kind of blue state on the right-hand side, where he kind of goes around in circles, occasionally walks into the wall, but then sort of randomly gets back onto back into track. And in that kind of critical phase, what's interesting about this is he has a tendency to suck himself to a wall. Just left to his own devices. So if you set him off running, he'll have a tendency to just start moving and then walk into a wall and then stick to the wall and then walk backwards and forwards along the wall as much as he fancies. Which is interesting to a certain extent because it simply shows that by manipulating the internal dynamics of the system without considering the kind of interaction with the external world, he has a tendency to produce different collections of behaviours. So if we go back to our original kind of internal dynamics, we've allowed this kind of threshold parameter to occur where the activity from the rest of the network feeds into each individual node and allows us to either trigger a move from the quiescent state into the active state by the passage of some kind of threshold, and that's the threshold that we set in the previous slides. And what we've allowed here is similar to our Wilson-Cowan approach, is a manipulation of the threshold based on the amount of activity that's being fed into the network from the external world. And we have basically two different parameters within that original thing. We have a learning rate, so that's how much change occurs within this threshold at each time step, and the overall target, the kind of target activity that we're looking for within each individual node. And what you can see in these plots on the left-hand side is that as you increase the targets, for a certain amount of the learning rate, it's actually very good at seeking the target that you're looking for. So at the very top here, that should look red, and the very bottom on the top plot, that should look blue. And you can see there's a kind of manipulation of the kind of dynamics that can occur within the system as a result of changing that kind of that learning rate. And the bottom plot is the kind of internal correlation structure as a very simple summary, but I'll skip over that for the moment. So if we, and the figure that I'm about to show is massive. There we go. If we look at various different parts of this parameter space, you can see there are a complicated collection of different dynamics that occur. So this is a kind of very, very high rate and very, very high target dynamic. And you can see there's a lot of activity that occurs, and the mean threshold itself changes a lot over time. That's our plastic phenomena. But again, it relates back to this idea that he kind of just walks into a wall and sits there. So the bottom plot that we've got at the bottom is simply how far the avatar sits away from the bounds of his cell over time. And we can look at this in different places, and again, it totally changes the kind of behavioural dynamics that occur. And generally speaking, when we have a high target rate, you don't tend to get this kind of interesting bouncy dynamic that is characteristic of this kind of critical state. But as soon as you move into these kind of low threshold areas, you begin to get this kind of dynamic activity that occurs within the model. So this kind of trace at the bottom shows us where the avatar is in relation to the wall. And in this sense, there's not a huge amount of coupling between the threshold and his actual movement. But if we allow adaptation to happen very quickly over time, you begin to see these kind of anti-correlations appearing within the system between the threshold and his distance away from the wall. So we get this kind of idea that he walks into the wall and his dynamic fundamentally changes as a product of the kind of external interaction that he has. And that is entirely to balance the system into this kind of critical regime that we see here. So looking at these traces of his behaviour a little bit more closely. At this kind of high learning rates, low target condition in these figures, This is just a kind of plot of his overall movement. So he starts in the kind of center of the system at the top left of this model. So you can see in the high rate, low target condition, he has this kind of slightly dynamic walk that occurs around time. He gets a bit stuck towards the beginning of the walk. But that's just because he's slowly learning what the environment looks like and learning his interaction with the environment. When we look at different parts of the parameter space, of course, he does much more crazy things that are largely characterized by sticking to walls. So when the target is very high, but his learning is relatively slow, he has a tendency to every now and again decide to turn around and walk away, but is fundamentally stuck to walls. And I'm just going to skip through the slide because it's taking forever to load each of the figures. Hang on. But the kind of take-home message here from this kind of very simple kind of dynamic analysis of his behaviour in relation to his functional activity is that when we think about kind of measures of critical analysis, when we go back to that kind of kappa measure that we were interested in before, the kind of relationship between kind of power law activity or kind of critical behaviour within the network is quite correlated with the regions where he produces these kind of very, very dynamic walks around the system and seems to interact well with the kind of bounds of the cell that he's sat in. So these two figures here are again both measures of kind of the critical dynamic that are occurring within the system. And on the right hand side, this is kind of dark blue. This is kind of log likelihood of a power law behaviour. And down in this kind of low target, high speed region, you get this kind of critical dynamic emerging. So there's all sorts of things that we potentially can do with this model going forwards in terms of thinking about behavioural dynamics. It's not just necessarily about him walking around the system and us saying, isn't it exciting that he moves around a lot more. One of the things that we have started to play with is the idea that his dynamic activity might relate to how he wanders around the space and can perform behavioural tasks. So this is a very simple foraging task that we've developed within this framework, and we can encode kind of reward to each of these individual tokens that he wanders around and picks up. And that can fundamentally change his kind of network configuration, or that can change the gating of his kind of functional activity, which will enable him to learn more about the environment that he's in. So we can get this kind of interaction between neurobiological mechanisms of learning. So we could look at ideas of dopaminergic sort of reinforcement type learning paradigms, as well as these kind of dynamic activities. So we can look at how dynamics relates to learning, therefore relates to the behaviour that occurs. And one of the other things that we're just starting to think about but haven't got very far with is a kind of fundamental question that's puzzled us in our group for a little while. One of the kind of classical kind of cognitive paradigms is this idea that there's this balance between the default mode network and task positive networks. And this is kind of classical data from the Kelly group in the US, which has shown this kind of anti-correlation between the activity of these two networks across the resting state. But the question really emerges: what's this actually for? There's a lot of talk about it being for, freewheeling and ideas of this being a network that switches on, that allows self-referential thought, and it's a network like that. But these are kind of slightly woolly explanations as to precisely what this network is here for. Some people have claimed it's just an artifact in functional imaging. It's something that occurs as a result of over-normalizing data in a kind of analysis approach. There's, of course, the kind of classical Randy Buckner approach that says this is a network that's specialized for task-independent thought and for kind of freewheeling. But, of course, we also show that Our TBI patients show impaired default mode network deactivation, and that in and of itself relates to cognitive decline. So it's in many ways clear that this kind of relationship between the default mode network and the task positive networks is fundamentally important for behavior, but we still really don't know why. We did, however, show a couple of years ago that there's a task spatial dependency within this default mode network. So a piece of work done by Rob Leach, who's one of my close collaborators, has shown that different tasks, so this is a combination of a motor task and a visual task, evoke very, very different default mode networks. So evoke spatially balanced default mode networks. So the default mode network that occurs during a motor task is subtly different from that of the visual task, and the relationship between each of these tasks is simply that the default mode network expands or contracts to match the level of activity that's occurring in the rest of the brain. So the default mode network, in a way, acts as this kind of cognitive sponge to suck up kind of extraneous activity in the brain. And this is interesting to us because it links back to this kind of original idea that we were thinking about in terms of local dynamics and kind of local balance between individual regions. So we say that excitatory and inhibitory neurons balance each other out to maintain this kind of rich, spontaneous dynamic over time, which plays out in this kind of behavioral dynamic. And we think there's a strong possibility that this is occurring at a macroscopic scale as well. We think that, there's lots of things about the brain that are scale-free, things that occur at a very local level might also occur at this kind of global level. And these kind of ideas feed into that. So this is certainly an approach that we want to start applying to the avatar approach. You could imagine that we could take the kind of avatar setup that that I described before, and build in a kind of task negative network on the global system as well. So you can see on the left-hand side I've shaded some of these in blue, so we can have both this kind of balance in terms of local dynamics, but also this kind of macroscopic balance as well. And this is stuff that we don't have a great deal of data on at the moment, but it's something that we're beginning to work on at the moment. And equally, our other previous theoretical work has shown that these kind of measures of synchrony and metastability that I talked about at the very top of the talk are strongly related to the kind of task that's currently occurring. So highly focused task activity is associated with this kind of very constrained dynamic that occurs in the brain, whereas rest is associated with this kind of debalanced, kind of unconstrained, constrained asynchronous activity. And the balance between these two things could therefore be related to this kind of sponge type approach to the default mode network that's sucking up kind of extraneous signal that's occurring elsewhere. Of course, when you're at rest, lots of kind of dynamic activities are occurring. Therefore, the default mode network is there to balance that out. And our empirical data, of course, shows that you do get this kind of strong dichotomy between functional activity at rest and during constrained task, and that relates as well to the kind of metastability measures. If I plot these guys out, you can see that kind of at the resting state you have this kind of rich kind of metastable dynamic. Whereas during the task you have this kind of very, very, very stable dynamic. So to sum up, I hope that I've shown you some kind of interesting ideas about how we can start to think about modelling the brain, not only just looking at functional models, but also start to think about modelling interactions with the external world at the same time. And I'd be very, very interested to talk to people about different ways that we can look at whole brain computational modelling approaches and kind of take in this kind of behavioural element at the same time. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Pete, for this very inspiring talk. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I was just curious as to, so I'm not sure if these hi, YouTube. This is essentially, I'm not sure if these animations are based directly from your data, but if so, I was just curious, there seems to be like a few nodes that never kind of make a functional link to any other nodes, like some of the in the temporal lobe, for instance.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that's an actual thing that you see in your data, or whether it's just this kind of animation is not representing what we actually see.
Yeah, so I mean, I ripped these animations from our simulation, just slightly haphazardly rather than particularly tuned them. The reason there are disconnected nodes here is because the threshold is set relatively high in terms of the connectivity. So there are nodes that simply never connect, but that's simply because the threshold is very high. In these dynamics, it could be that we reduce the system. You just change that value, and things get more connected. It's a tunable parameter.
Any more questions for
I should just say, whilst Paul's wandering around, these people did quite a lot of the work, and the Wellcome Trust give me lots of money. So thanks to them.
Yes, I wonder your different ICA components that you've shown about the time courses. What is your model? Is that you switch from one component to another, or you just have this complex overlap of all this together?
Yeah. So
is that a microstate, or does it fit with the ICA model of overlap?
I mean, the classical ICA approach doesn't particularly define microstates in and of itself. It simply produces spatial components that have some form of temporal dynamic that attach to them. I mean, the animation that I showed right at the very top, so this guy here, shows that, I mean, these functional networks, and you can see from this kind of this cartoon that functional networks do occur, and if you look within the system, there are things that represent these kind of that look a bit like the ICA components that occur, but they're very temporally transient. They're not things that just switch on and stay on. And even if you do this during tasks, so you do a constrained task in a block, you wouldn't see a network switch on during that thing. You might see it be more represented within your the mix of different motifs that you see over time. So there's a kind of complicated relationship between the two. In reality, I don't subscribe to the idea that there are functional networks that just switch on during tasks. It's this kind of dynamic interaction between the two. So my view has always ever been that the dynamics and the dynamic relationship between regions is probably where behavior sits, rather than regions being particularly task suited. I like to think of regions of the brain as having complicated multimodality functions, rather than being particularly the one that turns on when your eyebrows furrowed, or the one that particularly turns on when you're listening to something. They are functional motifs of a kind of wider temporal spatial dynamic that's specialized for a particular task.
Well, thanks again, Pete. And we can move on to the next speaker.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much for a great talk. Up next we have Dr.
All right, there we are.
from UPF.
Go on and get that. Yeah, I'll just break it.
Thanks. Currently a postdoctoral fellow at UPF. She's also doing a joint fellowship with not only UPF but also UNSW in Australia and Oxford University as well. Selwyn is a medical imaging scientist, now turned neuroscientist. And Selwyn is known for her amazing sense of direction. So whether she's in a city or a forest, she will always find her way home. And she also has a very strong preference for academics environments that are close to the beach. So she feels right at home here in Marseille and delivers a great talk. So that's you, Selwyn.
Yeah. I'm going to defend myself in a second. So. workshop dinner type of insights.
That was exactly what happened.
Exactly, yeah. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you for this very original introduction. And also, thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. It's actually quite interesting. Well, let me put the slides back on first. Because when I first started getting interested in the idea of harmonics and harmonic patterns in general, I was very surprised to see that they were actually quite universal. Just 1 second, sorry. Are you there?
It's there.
Is it there? It's connected, but let me start it again. This one?
Yeah, absolutely.
This place. It says no devices detected. I maybe use this one. This has worked.
Yeah.
Anything?
No. This is weird.
Okay. Well, I have it on a USB stick, but
Should work.
maybe try this.
So, do you have your...
I have it on a USB stick.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, okay, there we go. Finally. There was a second. Yeah? Okay, I don't touch it anymore. Okay, I'm not going to touch it anymore. So, leave the word. Sorry about that. So yeah, I mean, really glad to be part of this workshop because when I first started getting interested in the idea of harmonics and harmonic patterns, I was very surprised personally that they were really ubiquitous, emerging in all kinds of physical and biological phenomena. And I'm going to talk about them during the talk as well. But I noticed that no matter which context I was studying harmonics, I was always going back to harmonics in music. So for me personally, that was the most intuitive way to understand harmonics in general. And when we first introduced the idea of harmonic patterns in the brain, in brain activity, it was received with a little bit of a controversy in the neuroscience community. Maybe it was a bit of a too far stretch from music to the brain. So I really cannot think of any better environment to discuss all of these ideas fully than an interdisciplinary workshop called the Symphony of Modern Neuroscience. So during the talk, I'm going to be switching back and forth between these two parts. But I really want to start with the symphony part and actually even simplify it and start just simply with the harmonics. So if hopefully the video plays, I want to show you a film that illustrates really nicely one of my favorite experiments, Chladni's metal plate experiment, that has also inspired most of the work that I'm going to show you here today.
The film you're about to see has no characters. If you spare a little of your imagination, it is a film to describe to you the effect of cymatic frequencies on matter.
well, it's a really nice but a long film, so I need to stop it here. But I hope you have noticed these beautiful sand patterns that were emerging on the metal plate when a musical note was played on the keyboard. Now, if you look at why these patterns emerge, now any system that is capable of vibrating has certain preferred frequencies called its natural frequencies or resonance frequencies. And if you do manage to excite the system with one of its natural frequencies, then the system resonates and standing waves emerge on the system, in this case the metal plate. And these standing waves actually partition the metal plate into domains that oscillate up and down synchronously. So certain parts of the metal plate move up, whereas others go down, and then they switch back and forth. And of course, the sand accumulates at the boundaries of these regions. Now, the shape of the standing wave pattern that is emerging is determined by only two factors. One of them is the geometry of the underlying domain. So if you were to cut the metal plate in a different shape, then the standing wave patterns would automatically adapt themselves. And the second one is the frequency of vibration. So as you have also seen in the movie, when he was playing a different musical note, then the standing wave patterns or the sand patterns were changing. So when we change the frequency of oscillation, the spatial patterns also change. But also when we increase the frequency, we would observe increasingly more complex and increasingly more localized patterns. And this is in fact also how we create different sounds in a musical instrument. So when we play a different pitch which corresponds to a different frequency of oscillation, then for each of them there is a different standing wave pattern emerging within the musical instrument. Now, although these patterns are all seemingly very different and seemingly very, very complex, they are all actually predicted by one simple line of equation, and that is the Eigen decomposition of the Laplace operator. Now, I don't want to go too much into mathematical details, but I do want to highlight some interpretations about this equation. So, first of all, it's an Eigen decomposition of the Laplacian. Now, the Eigen decomposition gives you a pair of eigenfunctions, the size, and the eigenvalues, the accompanying eigenvalues. Now, how can we interpret an eigenfunction? Now, if we think of an operator as a set of rules that takes a pattern or takes a function and transforms it into a different one, then the eigenfunctions are the ones which transform back onto themselves. So they are the stable patterns or stable characteristic patterns, so to speak. And so here we are decomposing the Laplace operator, and the Laplacian actually lies at the heart of the classical theories of various different physical phenomena like heat, sound, electromagnetism, and many others. So, and the interpretation of the Laplacian, maybe one way of interpreting is that it measures the local anomalies. So it measures the amount of flow within a local neighborhood. Now, when we decompose the Laplacian, then the eigenfunctions of the Laplace give you the stable patterns of this flow. Now, in the movie that we have seen, they would give us the standing wave patterns, the stable patterns. And in a way, what we are doing with this equation, so the standing wave patterns are given by the eigenfunctions, and the corresponding eigenvalues give us the natural frequency of oscillation. So what it does, in a way, is it decomposes the spatial and the temporal aspects of a dynamical system. So the spatial part, which is the sand patterns, are given by the harmonic functions, which are the eigenfunctions of the Laplace, and the temporal oscillations are given by these natural frequencies, which are the eigenvalues, the corresponding eigenvalues. And it's very, very remarkable because nature seems to use the same equation to create patterns in various different phenomena. So we have seen here now that the eigenfunctions of the Laplace actually describe the standing wave patterns in mechanical vibrations, so for example in acoustics. But they also predict the electron orbits or the atomic energy levels in quantum mechanics. And they would also describe patterns emerging in electromagnetic interactions within a grid of ions, so in electromagnetism. But I think more interesting than any of these physical phenomena, they actually provide the building blocks of biological pattern formation in morphogenesis. So they would provide the building blocks of these animal code patterns, but I'm going to talk more about that in the second part of the talk. So let's switch to neuroscience a little bit, and let's briefly recall what we know about neural activity. Now, first of all, we know that a fundamental characteristic actually of mammalian brain activity is coherent oscillations. And these oscillations cover a very, very wide range of frequencies. You can't see it here, but around there. It's from 0.05 hertz all the way up to 500 hertz. And very remarkably, the frequency and amplitude of these oscillations actually change for different states of consciousness. So for example, in the normal conscious awake state, our neural activity would be mainly dominated by these high frequency, low amplitude alpha oscillations. And if we fall into deep sleep and lose consciousness, so to speak, then these high frequency oscillations turn into these low frequency, big amplitude, slow delta waves in deep sleep. And another very interesting property of these oscillations is that actually they are coherent or correlated among spatially distributed parts of the cortex. And this is the idea of these resting state networks that we have heard about. So, for example, you could even observe that in resting state functional magnetic resonance imaging data. So people have initially thought that if we put you into a scanner while you're resting and not doing any task, and if you look at your fMRI data, that would be just pure noise. But that wasn't the case. If you actually look at the seed location, and if we were to compute the correlations of the time course of that position on the cortex with all the rest of the cortex, we would see that human brain at rest exhibits a large-scale spatio-temporal organization, today called the resting state networks, and the fluctuations of neural activity within one network are synchronous. So another very surprising aspect was that these resting state networks were actually overlapping with the functional networks of the human brain. And these functional networks had been identified with previous cognitive paradigms, so not in the resting state. Now, besides these functional networks, there is actually one particular network that we also heard about in previous talks, which is called the default mode network, that actually increases its activity when you're resting, and it decreases its activity when you're involved in a cognitive task. So, of course, initially people have thought that could be the neural correlate of consciousness that everybody was looking for. But then it came as a big surprise when the default mode network was actually detected in anesthetized monkeys, and following that in humans in light sedation, in general anesthesia, and in light sleep. So that means that this type of correlated activity and these correlation structures actually transcends levels of consciousness. But recent studies have actually pointed out, yes, correlations do remain when you lose consciousness, but their spatial patterns may change. For example, they have found that the frontal cortex actually decouples from the default mode network. And maybe even more important or more relevant for this talk is that recent studies have found that there is only a limited repertoire of these functional connectivity patterns that you would observe in loss of consciousness, for example, in anesthesia. So your repertoire is becoming very, very limited. Now, coming to neuroanatomy, we have heard about the human connectome. Now, thanks to these recent developments in non-invasive in vivo imaging, now today we are enabled a new technology, the diffusion tensor imaging, to map all these long-distance white matter thalamocortical connections. And the complete set of these connections is termed the human connectome. Now, finally, if you look at the microscopic scale, we know these spatio-temporal patterns of cortical activity actually emerge due to the interplay between excitation and inhibition. And we also know the loss of consciousness is actually accompanied by either an increase in inhibition and or a decrease in excitation. So that's a very, very quick summary, I would say, about some aspects of neural activity that we know. And the question that we asked was, how can we fit all the pieces of this puzzle together? Now, can we derive a fundamental principle that relates structure, function, and neurophysiology in loss and recovery of consciousness? And this is exactly what brought us to the idea of harmonics in the brain. Now, in the beginning of the talk, we have seen how harmonics, or the Eigen decomposition of the Laplacian, could actually relate time, space, and geometry, because it was relating the temporal oscillations to the spatial patterns, the descent patterns, which adapt themselves to the underlying geometry. So the question that we asked was, could it really be the case that the same equation actually would predict or relate the cortical oscillations, the resting state networks, and relate them to the anatomy of the human brain, to the human connectome? To test that, we have to solve this equation, this time on the human connectome instead of the metal plate. And in order to do that, we have to apply the Laplace operator to the particular structural connectivity of the human brain. Now, we tried to do exactly that. So we took the magnetic resonance imaging data and we reconstructed the cortical surface. And then we took the diffusion tensor imaging data and we tracked the long-distance white matter connectivity, the thalamocortical fibers. And then we combined these two types of connections, the local connections coming from here and the long-distance connections from the thalamocortical fibers, in a graph structure. Now, maybe one aspect to mention is the one difference of this study was that we didn't use any kind of parcellation. So we are using every single vertex on the surface reconstruction. Now, we combine these two types of connections to create, let's say, the connectome, and we represent it as a graph structure. Now, the advantage of using a graph structure is that there is an equivalent of the Laplacian in graph theory. And actually, you approximate that continuous version of the Laplacian the more nodes you use in your graph, so the more information you have. So when we apply this graph Laplacian to the human connectome, we actually apply the Laplace operator to the particular connectivity of the human brain. Now, the only thing that remains to be done is to decompose this graph Laplacian into its eigenfunctions or eigenvectors and the eigenvalues. Now, if we do that, we saw that now, as expected, it was giving us these patterns of correlations or synchrony patterns emerging this time on the cortex. And as expected, they were showing correlations between distributed parts of the cortex. And again, as expected, for increasing frequency, we would observe increasingly more complex patterns emerging on the cortex. But what we actually didn't expect to see was that one of these harmonic patterns that we call connectome harmonics was actually matching the default mode network very closely, at least visually. So initially we thought that could be just specific for that particular subject. So we tested 10 individual subjects, independent subjects from the Human Connectome project. And we observed that it was systematically, there was one connectome harmonic that was matching the default mode network. And even when we evaluated the similarity between the default mode network and here I'm showing for the first 40 connectome harmonics, using two different types of similarity measures, we got a very significant increase for one of the harmonics across all 10 subjects, and that was always within the same frequency range. And that significance actually also remained in the group average. So so that was kind of encouraging to look also for other resting state networks. So we looked at the similarity of other resting state networks and the connectome harmonics patterns that we compute. And we found that actually each of these resting state networks was matching at different parts of the connectome harmonic spectrum. So in a way, it was giving us the connectome harmonic signatures of each of these resting state networks. Now that was kind of encouraging to say, yes, it really could be the case that this equation, this eigen decomposition of the Laplacian or the connectome harmonics could really link the temporal oscillations, the resting state networks, and the anatomy given by the human connectome. But there is one big remaining question, and that is, if it's really true, if these harmonic patterns really emerge in neural activity, then there must be a mechanism creating them. There must be a neural mechanism. And from what we know about the brain, we know that it's the neurophysiology and the balance between excitation and inhibition which is giving rise to these oscillatory patterns that we observe. So the question is, how do the connectome harmonic patterns that we compute relate to neurophysiology? Now, in dynamical systems like the brain, when there are two different types of elements, like an activator and an inhibitor, for example, in the brain it would be the excitation and inhibition, then the local interactions between these two types of elements actually gives rise to self-organization of structured patterns, as we have also nicely seen an example with the environment in the previous talk. So here you see patterns of fish concentration. And these patterns actually self-organize because the little fish want to be close to each other and they would like to keep a distance to the sharks. So these local interactions actually naturally give rise to the emergence of these spatial patterns. And the first mathematical model for this type of self-organization was actually proposed by Alan Turing as a chemical basis for morphogenesis. Now today, Turing models are very well known and they are called reaction diffusion mechanisms. And what is really remarkable about these reaction diffusion mechanisms is that the initial stages of pattern formation by these type of mechanisms actually poses the same eigenvalue problem as that describing the vibration of thin plates. And that we have seen is nothing other than the eigen decomposition of the Laplacian. So actually Murray and his colleagues went a step further, and more than showing it mathematically, they showed it experimentally. So they cut metal plates in shape of animal skins and they captured the standing waves emerging on them, and they observed that they were actually resembling the animal code patterns and for different animals for different frequencies, actually very remarkably. Now, these type of models, it's not only the zebra patterns that these type of models can predict. They have already been applied to cortical pattern formation, as we have also heard from Victor's talk in the morning. But when you apply them to the brain, they are called neural field models, no longer reaction diffusion models. So these models, when applied to the early visual areas, they could very successfully predict the ocular dominance patterns, for example, between left and right eye. And but more impressively, they could predict different types of hallucinations and very particular types of hallucinations that you would experience if you were to take a certain type of drug, for example. I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. Or if you're looking at a flickering screen, you would also hallucinate. And these hallucinations would be very specific, and they could be predicted by these neural field equations. Now, what we did was to extend these neural field models, because in these examples that I showed, in the visual cortex, for example, the visual cortex is modeled like a two-dimensional sheet. So we just numerically simulated the same equations on the full structural connectivity of the human brain. Again, no parcellation, so it's a very dense representation of the connectome. And if we numerically simulate these equations, what we found was, yes, these cortical oscillations naturally self-organize from the interplay between excitation and inhibition. But beyond that, what we observed was when we decreased the excitatory parameter in the model or increased the inhibitory parameter in the model, we observed that there was a slowing down in the cortical oscillations. Now, that was very interesting because this is exactly what we know from neurophysiological changes in loss and recovery of consciousness. So we know that excitation decreases and inhibition increases in loss of consciousness. So if we make the model lose consciousness in a way, then we observe that the cortical oscillations actually slow down. And this is also what we would observe, for example, these high frequency oscillations would turn into low frequency delta waves, for instance, in deep sleep, in loss of consciousness. So now, because these harmonic patterns, these connectome harmonics, are actually the building blocks of these neural field models, or let's say building blocks of the complex patterns that we would observe in neural field models. And because they are orthogonal and independent, we can actually analyze the neural field equations in terms of the activity of these connectome harmonic patterns. And this is really not very different from decomposing a musical piece or a symphony into its musical notes. So firstly, we decompose the model. Well, it's not visible here, but if we decrease the excitatory parameter in the model, then what happens is the model becomes very limited to the activation of a narrow range of low frequency connectome harmonics. And the exact opposite is actually true for inhibition. So if we increase inhibition, then what happens is that the range of the connectome harmonics that the neural field model can activate collapses to a narrow range of low frequencies. Now that was a nice observation because this is again what we know from the neural correlates of consciousness from the recent studies which point out that the repertoire of functional connectivity states actually narrows down in loss of consciousness. And in our framework, the repertoire of functional connectivity states is nothing other than these connectome harmonics actually. So in the last part of the talk, I want to show you what happens to connectome harmonics if you were to take a psychedelic compound called LSD and how that could actually make you a better jazz musician. And this morning I actually was told by a jazz musician himself, well, not himself, but there are quite a few jazz musicians which do use these type of drugs apparently, and now it's understandable why. So in this study, in collaboration with the Division of Brain Sciences at Imperial College London, what we did was we took the fMRI data of healthy subjects which were given the psychedelic compound LSD, and instead of looking at the fMRI data in the conventional neuroimage analysis methods using them, we just decomposed fMRI activity into the activity of these connectome harmonics. So in a way what we did was we defined these harmonics as the brain states, and we looked at the activity of these brain states. Again, it's really not very different than decomposing a musical piece into its musical notes. Now, maybe before I show you the results, I just tell you what is the advantage of using this type of technique instead of just like a normal conventional fMRI analysis. Now, Nikola Tesla said, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Now, because these connectome harmonics are by definition the vibration modes of the human connectome, if we use them as brain states, we can actually very simply compute the energy and power of each of these connectome harmonics. So the power would be the strength of activation, so how much that particular brain state, how much that particular connectome harmonic would contribute to your neural activity. And the energy, we define it as the combination of this power or this strength and the intrinsic energy of that brain state. And that intrinsic energy comes from the frequency of it, which we already kind of know from the eigenvalue. So, in the experimental design, the subjects were given either the psychedelic compound, LSD, or they were given a placebo. And for each subject underwent 3 sessions, 3 scans, 3 fMRI scans. In the first and the third scan, they were just resting. They were lying in the scanner. And in the second session, they were listening to music as well. So when we looked at the total power and total energy of brain activity, not over time, but in general, what we observed was there was a significant increase in the total power and total energy of brain activity under the effect of LSD. And if we actually compute the probability of observing a certain energy value, then we saw a clear shift here in the peak towards high energy values under the influence of LSD, and even more so for this peak position here when the subjects were listening to music. So it really indicates that the psychedelics were increasing the total energy and total power of brain activity. Then, when we looked at which of these harmonic brain states were actually increasing their energy, so we looked at the whole connectome harmonic spectrum, shown here as well, and we found actually a narrow range of low frequencies. Now this is a logarithmic scale, so it's a really narrow range of low frequencies decreased their energy, and a very broad range of high frequencies were increasing their energy under the effect of LSD. Now that indicates that actually what LSD does is it kind of shifts your brain activity towards high frequencies, which are more likely to be silent in the normal resting state. And then we did look at the extent of the repertoire, so how many brain states were actually contributing to your neural activity in LSD and in placebo. So here you're looking at the probability of having a projection value, having a strength. And what we see here is that the probability, actually what LSD does to your brain is very similar to jazz improvisation. Because in fact, there are studies which have shown that improvising jazz musicians play significantly more musical notes compared to memorized play. And this is exactly what we find that LSD does to your neural activity. So there are more harmonic brain states which are mathematically equivalent to these musical notes that are is the constantly shifting battle zone characteristics that we can observe. So one of them, as mentioned, are the power laws. So if you were to plot different observables of your system in the logarithmic coordinates, then we would observe that they would follow a line which is in the... Now when we looked at our data, so the maximum power of connectome harmonics across the whole spectrum of connectome harmonics in the logarithmic scale, we actually found, yes, it was fairly closely following the power laws. And that was the case for actually both, for LSD and placebo. But what was different was that in LSD, because these low frequencies decrease their power and high frequencies increase, this curve is matching the power law distribution much more closely. So that actually indicates that in terms of criticality, LSD shifts your brain dynamics further towards criticality. Because there is, in the literature, many studies suggest that brain activity at rest is close to criticality, but slightly in the subcritical regime. And what we find that LSD does to your brain activity is that it's actually bringing it further towards criticality, even more closer to criticality. And we didn't observe these power law distributions only for the maximum power, but the average power and also the power fluctuations were following power laws. Now, these results encouraged us to say, in a way, that harmonics at the edge of criticality may really be the a fundamental principle underlying these complex dynamics, complex cortical dynamics that we observe, as they actually do many other natural phenomena. And so how these complex dynamics and how these critical dynamics actually change, for example, in psychiatric disorders, that still remains to be explored, because there are studies which suggest that, for example, in epileptic seizures, brain dynamics are moving towards the supercritical regime. And there are actually studies which propose that depression and addiction may be accompanied by brain dynamics which are more towards the ordered, more rigid type of dynamics, like the subcritical regime. And how these dynamics, these critical dynamics change in these psychiatric disorders, that remains to be explored still. But we are very eager to go further that path, and these results in a way suggest that they may give us, like, this criticality concept combined with the harmonics may give us some insights about the neural signatures of these psychiatric disorders. So with that, I would like to thank all my colleagues and collaborators who have contributed immensely at various different stages of this work. In particular, Joel Pearson, Isaac Donnelly, Gustavo Deco, and Morten Kringelbach, and also, of course, Human Connectome Project and Imperial College London for really nice data. And would like to thank you all for your attention. If you have any ideas to extend this further or any questions, we'll be very happy to discuss.
So thank you very much, Saul, for a great talk. Very exciting methods, I think, to understand the spatio-temporal organization of activity in the human brain. Any questions for Saul?
So yeah, thank you again. It was very inspiring indeed. I have basically a full battery of questions, but I'll just ask you two. One is more technical.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned this population operator, and for physicists it's kind of a whole friend or a whole foe. But there are many definitions of this object. And so then the question was, what definition do you use?
Laplacian?
Yeah. And for the Laplacian, yeah. The second one would be, you have talked about these harmonics and made connection to music, and you explored actually the symphony and neuroscience and all this thing was indeed exactly the same flavors, we shall discuss later. But in music, those harmonics are temporal, while functions, Eigen functions you showed, are spatial. Because they are distributions over the brain of something. And so my question was, you have already explored or you have ideas on how then these harmonics that are spatial functions do behave.
Well, so the first technical question, we did try many different versions of Laplacian, and we didn't observe, at least for the range of harmonics that we checked, big differences in the harmonics. And in this case, we are using the symmetric normalized version of the Laplacian to have an orthonormal basis, but that is the only motivation. But all the others, they also gave very nicely, smoothly changing harmonic patterns throughout the cortex, so that wasn't an issue. The second question, so the spatial parts, that's why I was very eager to show you these metal plates. Yes, the harmonics are like the way we know them, because we hear the temporal changing in the sound waves, but what is happening in the instrument is a spatial pattern. And the decomposition, that equation actually gives you both. It gives you the temporal as well as the spatial aspect. And that was the motivation, that because we know in temporal activity, we know there are many different frequencies. And in the spatial sense, we know that there are the resting state networks. So that was the motivation to follow this path and compute the Eigen functions of the Laplace as well. Because, so the harmonics, as we call them in the spatial sense, are the spatial patterns that accompany different frequencies, but technically they are actually an extension of the Fourier basis to the Kimball connectome. So there is an intrinsic relation between the spatial and temporal aspect of it. One limitation that I want to mention is that because we don't have the material properties in the model, we don't know the exact frequency. So we can't say this harmonic corresponds, let's say, alpha waves, or this harmonic corresponds to delta waves. We can't say that. But we have an order of harmonics. So that's why there's an intrinsic relation already in the decomposition itself between time and space.
Sorry, we have the power of the mic. I had a comment also to the Laplace, and then maybe ask you for your thoughts with regard to this. First of all, the comment is basically you said in real field theory we don't call it reaction diffusion equations anymore. The reaction diffusion equations are actually based on the Laplacian, and neural field theory is more general because in neural field you can define a local interaction kernel. And actually, when you look at all these patterns that you showed here, there is actually a theorem that shows for any type of linear-based interaction, the most general way to formulate this mathematically is via so-called Volterra-Wiener equations, which are integral equations. It's becoming a little technical, but it's important. This is an integral operator that allows you to interact with all the other neighbors, network, or that be continuous. This one, this is true, it's translationally invariant. If that's the case in Coulomb interactions, weak interactions, gravitational interactions, etc. So for almost all the forces in the world, except for the connectome in the brain. This is where I'm going. This one, when you expand this one for very short interaction length with regard to the size of the system, you, as a first order approximation, you always get the Laplacian, by definition, unless there is a symmetry breaking in there, and then you have a gradient.
It's really good to know.
If there is no symmetry breaking in there, by definition, it must be the Laplacian. That explains the generality of these results. And it's always these long-term patterns, these long wavelengths that you see here. It cannot be any other way. Having said this, the fact where the fact that you obtain these patterns in the top left corner, it cannot be any other way. Top left is so this one. Having said this, that you have a bias towards certain patterns, that is a completely different situation. This bias must come from the bottom, the underlying skeleton or avatar that was said earlier, that is biasing this into a particular direction. This, in your case, it is the connectome.
Exactly.
And so this bias is highly interesting. The fact that you can reproduce this with the Laplacian, it's generic. It cannot be any other way. But so the biases and their linkages to the time domain, this I find highly interesting. So if I understand that correctly, you want now the patterns that you're finding there linkage to the temporal domain. Can you make statements about this, how this connects to the underlying connectome? Because you did not look at this explicitly, but it's, as I just explained, implicitly it must be in the biases that you find through the Laplacian. Do you have any ideas on this?
So I think it's a very, very important point. So firstly, I just make a comment about the neural field models. So the equations that we simulated here were the general Wilson-Cohen equations, and that's why I showed you the examples on the cortical pattern formation with the hallucinations and so on, where people have used the exact same equations, but because they model the cortex like a two-dimensional sheet, they can simply apply a Gaussian, and then that would be the same as the reaction diffusion equations. But how are you going to apply the Gaussian kernel on a connectome structure? That was the challenge. So the way we address that issue or that problem was we used the Laplace again to iteratively simulate the fusion process on the connectome. So it is really the same as the reaction fusion equations or Wilson-Cohen equations as known neural field models. This time extended to the connectome using the Laplace. So that was the trick that Laplace was doing. But it is really great to know that it couldn't be any other than Laplace. And the second aspect, the temporal aspect of how these complex patterns or harmonic patterns evolve, this is where we're actually very excited about the criticality aspect and how they relate to criticality, because when we look at the distribution, we do see indications of criticality and how these, I mean, it's a maybe a naive way to interpret it, but I always use that analogy when I think about them. If you think of music really, then each of these harmonic modes is one note, one musical note, and what the questions that you can ask about the temporal evolution of the brain activity is like, what kind of music are you playing using these kind of brain states or these kind of harmonic states? And that itself is, I think, very, very interesting, but besides decomposing the functional neuroimaging technique like fMRI or MEG into these harmonic states over time, I think with models you can do a lot, but if you're looking at the data itself, then the most intuitive way for me is to proceed with the way I showed you, decomposing the MEG or fMRI data over time and looking at characteristics emerging in the dynamics over time. But if you have any other ideas, I would be very happy to discuss them.
Thank you very much. So we have time for one last question. There's actually both Theo and Alain who
yeah, it was half a comment, half a question. You talked about criticality when showing a power law. I'd be very careful with that because power laws are a consequence of criticality, but you cannot infer criticality from just the power law. And to have criticality, you need a driving parameter that you can tune. So when, for instance, when you say that the LSD case is closer to criticality, what would be the tuning parameter?
So based on the literature, we believe what tunes the neural activity towards criticality is rather the excitation-inhibition balance, or any pharmacological intervention that the psychedelic compound does to your neural activity. We can model it using this type of changes in, in the end of the day, it's a certain drug that is affecting your neural activity, and if you think about that in terms of a driving force, that would be, for example, in loss of consciousness, it's easier to talk about the change in excitation-inhibition balance, but this is, I think, what is the driving force behind the criticality.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellen. We might have time for one final question.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, my question is actually a comment on this temporal spatial scales, because if I understood well, you did a link between the Turing patterns and zebra and the zones in the brain, but these are the stationary Turing patterns.
Yes, yeah.
There's also a theory for waves Turing patterns, where you can find analytically also the time frequency.
Yeah.
So did you try to do this?
It is true that the Turing patterns are the stable ones that we have also seen in Victor's talk in the morning. It's a different regime. What we get is the oscillatory ones. And the way we looked at the relationship between space and time was using two different kinds of methods, the linear stability analysis in terms of harmonics, so which brain states, and we know low frequencies correspond to slow oscillations and high frequencies correspond to faster oscillations. And then for the same parameter set, we numerically simulated systematically all these oscillations and looked at the frequency of oscillation over time. And they were following the red curves that I showed you from the linear stability analysis. So it was confirming in a way. The one limitation that I mentioned was we can't know the exact frequency, but we know that faster oscillations emerge in that way.
I think you can get this from data. Because it actually is the same equation.
Yeah.
That is, for me, is electron diffusion, for you is neural field.
Yeah.
And according to the real part, imaginary part of the eigenvalues, you can have also the frequency part, the temporal frequency part, not just the spatial.
Yeah, we did exactly that, but
so did you find the?
But the frequency in terms of like we can't relate it to hertz. This is what I was saying. Maybe if we model the neural field models more realistically with all the properties, the structural properties and so on, not only the anatomy, then we can talk about this hertz and that. But the way we modeled or the way we simulated this is that let's say excitation propagates 3 times, whereas inhibition propagates 5 times over time, one time point. But that time interval is undefined in terms of milliseconds. So that's why I am a little bit shy to claim that particular frequency. But we can claim the relationship between frequencies. So we know faster oscillations versus slower oscillations and what ratio. But we exactly looked at we decomposed the neural field models into the evolution of these harmonics, and then looked at the eigenvalues, so linearized them. But thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to take a 15-minute coffee break and reconvene at 3:15. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks again to all the speakers for today, and thanks for the audience that had the courage to remain through the panel discussion. So the idea of today's meeting was to sort of give a vision, or not a vision, but have like different angles to look at what people study in the brain, like whether it's like high-level cognitive outputs or much more microscopical whole brain modeling, and to show that there is indeed quite a broad range of people looking at the same system but from different angles and aspects. And the idea was to bring them together to sort of so that they can discuss among each other that something that they might not necessarily do, and try and maybe devise what are the sort of big questions and next step that they could cross-pollinate to try and address. And I think a common pattern that's like 2 keywords that showed up like many different times today in all the different talks is this notion of spatio-temporal patterns, which is obviously kind of evident that these concepts would be present because we live in space and time, so we need to integrate information and etc. But it's also very clear that if we want to capture these aspects and understand them and use them for maybe clinical applications and understanding just how the brain works, then it's clear that it's still very challenging and we're lacking maybe the right tools to actually capture the essential features that we need. And that's why we wanted to have Alain, for example, today, because maybe network theory or extension of network theory could be very helpful to as a language to capture these sort of features. And yeah, so I think maybe we could take questions from the audience, but I think I have something that I would be really interested in is is it still meaningful to talk about the notion of a brain state? Because we've seen that the brain function is evolving constantly, and many different things changes. And it seems that we are still sort of entrenched in this sort of phrenological approach to the brain. So certain regions or even certain networks of regions do certain function. But even when you talk about just a network doing a function like the default mode network or the attention network, etc., you're still putting a sort of label on a set of things that do a specific task. So you still have sort of broader phrenological approach. And I think Peter said something quite interesting along these lines, that he sees the different brain regions as multimodal operators that, depending on how they integrate spatio-temporally, give rise to different type of function, basically, and how like his avatar starts hitting the wall, for example. And so I would be very interested to have your opinion on that. So I don't know if somebody wants to start. I won't give any answer, so don't look at me like that. I'm not going to answer anything.
They need maybe a microphone.
Yes, but I'm waiting for someone to volunteer to.
Why don't you give someone a microphone? Something magic will happen.
Something magic will
I vote
happen.
for
So.
Peter.
Yeah, I think Peter was a good
candidate to start. Yeah, well, I don't know if I am a candidate to start,
Sorry
but
to put you on the spot.
I'll try and say some words. Yeah. I mean, it's something that I've struggled with for probably as long as I've worked in cognitive neuroscience, this idea of moving past the spectre of phrenology. It's true today that it's no longer really acceptable within human brain mapping to do general linear modelling approaches to cognitive psychology. That gave way in the late 90s and early 2000s to looking at a kind of more holistic network-based approach, which again comes from the idea of seed-based functional connectivity, and then is adapted into these kind of model-free, more ICA-based approaches. But the things that they have in common are still this idea of looking at ever more complicated blobs and saying, that is the site of attention, that is the site of a certain cognitive function. Of course, these things are complicated by the fact that breakdown in connectivity within these networks is also associated with cognitive decline in many of the areas that they are discussed within. But equally, it's as was true with phrenology, it's definitely true that depending on your perspective or your particular background, you might identify a particular network within the brain with a particular cognitive task. So one of my favourite examples of this is what's known as the salience network, or the pain matrix, or the temporospatial frontoparietal control network. We're all talking about exactly the same networks here, but depending on precisely what your neocognitive bending is, you tend to identify them with the task that is associated with your thing. So my tendency is to assume that when there's all of these kind of overlaps and these kind of these discontinuities between different cognitive states, we're probably looking at bits of brain that do many, many things. And I don't tend to subscribe to a model that suggests that there are any particular parts of the brain that are anything other than part of a bottom-up pathway or multimodal integration units, if you like, that rearrange spatially and temporally depending on the cognitive context that's involved. I mean, that makes life very, very complicated. In the long run, but it's the brain that's very complicated. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
I can say a little bit from my naive perspective on this, and it's also that one of the things I was very frustrated on when I started was this static view on the brain. Well, I started my PhD in 2002 or 3, whatever, and I didn't know much about the brain at that time. But the thing was that people at that time wanted to say, well, when we, for instance, have language, we have a theory of how language works, and then we want to identify how the brain actually encodes this theory. So we have an area for syntax, we have it, and so forth. This idea, and I think an important thing from what we do in our center and the types of researchers that I am, cognitive researchers in these fields, is to try to go away from our first ideas of how we used to think about the stimulus, for instance, music, language, or so, and try to get away from having these kinds of hypotheses that are mostly driven about how we have been thinking for 200 years about our stimulus. And it's kind of the same thing you're saying, just with a different perspective. What I started out was just to say, well, at that time when I started, everybody would say, well, music is basically right lateralized in the brain. It's a very simple thing. And I said, I simply don't believe in a brain that works like that. So that was why I started to try to find out whether I could activate the left hemispheric brain structures, which proved to be much easier than I thought. And this sort of dynamic idea of what a brain can do and is, I think, is important to try to find some paradigms that can actually tap into that to show that there's so many things involved in what we think about as brain states.
I mean, just a tiny remark on that, because I think you touched on something that's really important. I mean, previously we thought about the brain like I say, like a set of buttons. You press that button, that happens, and so on. And now we are just in the middle of like a paradigm shift where we acknowledge it's a spatio-temporal activity and patterns that is going on. Maybe in my humble opinion, the next step is like deriving the principles underlying these spatio-temporal patterns and understanding, because the patterns themselves and the spatio-temporal dynamics are so complex, it's really easy to lose sight of what is going on. Now I'm happy that we have moved from this button analogy to more dynamic analogy, and all the talks today were really showing lots of examples of what is going on in terms of space and time. And I feel that the next step to simplify all these complex dynamics is maybe questioning the principles creating this type of complexity.
So, yeah, I think you brought up something very interesting, is this notion of having a model for how the brain works, basically, or a model that you can use to make inferences, predictions, and this is probably what you're sort of aiming at, is having like a heuristic model that enables you, for example, to predict clinical interventions for epilepsy, or maybe for traumatic brain injury, stroke, see how that affects, so how different injuries can affect the patient outcome, and then maybe try to alleviate some of these outcomes by understanding how the system works as a whole. And so do you think we're close to a place where we could have a model, like a predictive model that can have actually like clinical relevance to patients, for example? Yeah.
Directly to me. The very brief response to your question is yes, but I will not pass on the mic right away. I'll put it a little bit into the context of brain states, since we just discussed that. So, and then also from the clinical perspective. I have a little split opinion upon the notion of brain states. On the one hand side, I think, yes, we are in an era where everyone acknowledges the brain is dynamic. Obviously, it's not static, as it is implied by brain state, but everyone will also acknowledge that state can be also a dynamic object, can have particular properties. So if all of us continue talking about brain states from a more abstract general perspective, then this would be acceptable in the sense that these states now are representing certain dynamic properties that may be spatio-temporal, etc. Then that may be okay. On the other hand, so like this we can rescue the notion of brain states. At the other hand, I think through the back door comes our impoverished battery of tools that is still based in the tradition of stationarity, in the tradition of interpreting elements in a static fashion, and that we are applying this. So we are saying, yes, it is a dynamic process, and then we apply the same old battery of static/stationary tools and are performing the same analysis in a more sophisticated fashion, but still the static picture comes in. Example, all of us, one way or another, have used the expression functional connectivity, including myself, and then we are replacing the static brain state by a static functional connectivity, even though we acknowledge it's dynamic, but then we are analyzing it in a classic way as if it were a state and putting it in relation with cognitive states or with a diseased state, for instance. This functional connectivity is representative for the resting state of epileptic patients, etc. So I see this over and over again, and I see this also in my own work. I catch myself that I'm doing this, and we have still not embraced the dynamic nature of the brain in our language, in our thinking, in the way how we treat behavior, in the way how we treat brain dynamics. And that may be excusable because of the long tradition of usage of tools that we have developed. However, we will not advance much further if we don't accept that and embrace it. Otherwise, it will be just a higher order phrenology that is hiding behind very fancy and complicated jargon, but it will remain a static approach towards the description of brain dynamics and behavioral dynamics. And this is where I consider also for the future the bottlenecks for clinical applications. And we have just seen this. Someone mentioned, I think it was Alain that was talking about functional connectivity dynamics, that this seems to be one of the future avenues in order to characterize patients or perform patient stratification. And I do believe that. But it's only just happening right now. Yeah? We have to overcome this, and this will become then a quantum, hopefully a quantum jump in neurosciences.
Thanks for
either directions.
That's actually one of the main concerns right now in science is this lack of dynamic analysis. New methods are being developed right now, which seem to be quite promising in trying to capture that dynamic over time. Other than just using sliding window techniques, which everyone acknowledges that there's very strong limitations to it. But just maybe just going back a little bit to Paul's question, one of the concerns that I see as a neuroscience nowadays is the lack of link between scales or the lack of scalability. There's a lot of research at the microscale. Most of the research we talked about today, it's either mesoscale to microscale, but there seems to be a gap to microscale analysis. So looking at the neuron, individual neuron, or two neuron coupling or communication. So how do you see this overcome? Because of course, I know that there's a huge limitation on the neuroimaging techniques we use nowadays to capture this transition. So do you think that to answer the underlying mechanisms or the question of trying to understand the physiology or the biophysics underlying brain dynamics, do we need to fulfill this gap between microscale and meso and macroscale?
So I guess maybe one way of rephrasing your question is it important to understand like the underlying chemistry of the brain to understand its functioning? Basically, do we need this, or can we simply like assume that there's a sort of cut-off scale and like neural mass models are good enough to capture all the complexity we need to actually address like clinical questions or the sort?
Sort of, because the chemistry part can be partly responded with PET imaging, for example, regardless of its spatial and temporal limitations. But I mean, just going very, very much into the physics itself, not only chemistry, but also physics at the single neuron level. Because I seem to well, all these methods we're using right now, computational methods, are missing that link, I think. At least that's what I think. But some of the methods used for network theory are exactly the same at all scales. So it's scalable. But I see that computational models are not scalable. And there's just too many different approaches right now. I know it's just a new area. It's growing very fast. But I seem to feel a little bit confused on the lack of convergence between approaches in terms of scalability.
Any thoughts on that?
I'm not entirely sure. Let me see if I understand your question correctly. Bye, Marcel. The certain descriptions are useful, and you put it was you who put it into a clinical context. If you want to design a neurochemical intervention, for instance, using a pharmaceutical approach, you have to understand some parts of the signaling pathways, the molecular, the cellular signaling pathways, because this is where the pharmaceutics takes it as an entry point. Understanding the molecular signaling pathways when dealing with a different type of intervention such as surgery will be probably less relevant, but their neuroimaging on a completely different scale, structural and functional imaging, will play a more significant role. So these two things are not incommensurate. However, what you were, then you made the link towards modeling, and the way I understood you is that you're criticizing that we do not have yet a converging picture of a multi-scale model, and you can defend yourself. Yeah.
It's still work in progress, and I understand that.
Yeah.
But my main, it's both a concern. It's both a concern, and also a bit of serendipity to see that we sometimes get better fit with empirical data with using very simple models such as the Chromosome Model, instead of just using models that go down to the mesoscale and other than just looking at oscillatory behavior, and which are a lot more detailed. They contain a lot more information, but they don't provide us better estimates or fittings with empirical data. So my question is, if you actually come along with more complex methods that cannot explain as better as simple models, then there's something missing here. Is it like introducing complexity? Is it actually just improving the outputs, or is it just increasing the degree of entropy?
I'll pass it on then afterwards. Oh, sorry. Okay, very rapidly. Then I did understand your question correctly, and it remains a level of interaction and the level on which you want to intervene. You brought up the Chromosome model. This is an oscillatory model that by definition cannot stop to oscillate. Yeah? So you limit yourself to very frequency-specific interactions that you look at on the neuroimaging level. This is probably what you had in mind. There is a legion of ways of generating the same type of oscillations, yeah, that you have, for instance, represented in an oscillator like a Chromosome model. But the bottom line is, on this level of organization, it does not play a role how you generate the oscillation on the level that you want to look at it, in the fMRI level or on the EEG level. Yeah, so it doesn't even matter, because you could generate in thousands of ways through physiological manipulation. Yeah, you can generate on the single neuron level and then going to the population level the same type of oscillations. Yeah, so it becomes an ill-posed question. Yeah, there is actually converging evidence, but we have to respect that there are millions of ways of generating this type of oscillations with different parameter configurations, and the same manipulation on one physiological level for this configuration will generate this oscillation, but when you change a few other parameters, and then the original manipulation that you used will not work anymore. So we have to embrace this, accept that, and that's the reason why this mean field approach on this level of organization that is accessible to you via neuroimaging makes actually sense. You're dying to say something.
No, it's just something maybe from the philosophical perspective to say the same thing that you were saying. Like every model is an abstraction, so you introduce assumptions and you model it in a way. So at certain level of abstraction, it really, like you said, it doesn't matter which mechanism gives rise to these oscillations, and that's why maybe my emphasis on the principles. So you can think of oscillations as a principle. The system oscillates, and there are various different mechanisms, at different levels of abstraction to create the same effect. And at that level of your model, it really doesn't matter which of these mechanisms gave rise to it. But I do understand your emphasis of the gap, because if we knew exact mechanisms which gave rise to observed behavior like oscillations, then of course we could do more. And there is a gap, but I think it was the case, for example, if you look at Turing's model, when he first proposed this for morphogenesis, he suggested some things like morphogens, and nobody knew that anything like that existed. But nowadays, so it was a leap that he did with the let's assume these exist. And nowadays we know it works differently. Nevertheless, there is evidence for the model. So sometimes we have to jump a little with the liberty, I guess.
Yeah, I think I'm tempted to agree with everything that's said above. I mean, my view of computational modelling, part of the magic of playing with computational models is that you can insert into them what it is that you want to play with in the first place. So a lot of the time, the computational model and the level of abstraction you pick is driven by the hypothesis you're trying to test, rather than that you could make a terribly detailed model of a thing. I mean, there's a couple of papers that I really like in this respect, thinking about exactly this complexity problem. And there's one by Marolek a couple of years ago that looks at a suite of different computational models and looks at how they compare and contrast in terms of their complexity and the overall fit to functional data, and it concludes that in reality, very simple autocorrelation models will produce, relatively good functional connectivity compared to extraordinarily complicated mean field models, and that's fine in a way. But encoded within that autocorrelation problem is not the ability to manipulate the balance between neural subunits. Whereas hidden within the Wilson-Cowan model, for example, you have the ability to ask formulated hypotheses about your underlying system. And to go back to your original question, it's kind of like what is missing in terms of jumping between these two scales. I don't think is necessarily a question that needs to be answered by producing very, very complicated computational models. And there's a long history of producing extraordinarily complicated models of stuff. And this can go back to Lorenz's original assumptions about trying to predict the weather. There probably is not enough complexity in the world in order to directly simulate our brain in infinite amounts of detail, but if we go back to the ideas of thinking about underlying principles, so thinking about ideas of scale-free organization, or thinking about things like criticality or metastable dynamics, those are the things that we can look at between different classes of models, or models that contain different assumptions. And therefore, you're not really looking for an explicit link between the two in terms of the computational model, or producing a model that you can scale between different complexities of connectivity, but you're looking at specific manipulations of models and looking for those general patterns between models that tell us the heart of how the brain is organized.
Yes, I'm very interested by this multi-scale, actually. I'm trying to follow up on that. We're already recording, so I'm more from a signal processing perspective, but I want to ask you in terms of theory. We're already recording at the mesoscale and the macro scale because we're doing intracerebral EEG with MEG simultaneously, so we already have 2 scales. And we're starting to consider to have the micro scale because now in humans we can have micro contacts, so some intracerebral EEG electrodes have the capacity. So we're trying to solve the technical issues for that, but then I'm already thinking how are we going to analyze such complex data. So do you have ideas if we have these different levels of recordings? Do you have some theories we can be based on, or very practical, maybe network, multi-level network analysis theory that already exists that we can use, because we're going to be tackling very horribly complex data sets?
Maybe Alain, you want to...
In fact, rather than answering your question, I would tend to add a level of complexity to it, is that you will have very partial information and incomplete information, and we know that it is a very big problem then to infer the rest. So it goes back also to the issue of different scales. And for instance, when I was representing these different representations of very detailed temporal networks, actually why it is interesting to use very summarized representations such as contact matrices, you have lost a lot of information, but if you have incomplete data, maybe these representations in fact are still accurate. So you can represent basically fake data that are very similar statistically to your original data, and you don't really care that it's the true data. They have the right statistical properties so that you can do something with them. So sometimes having very, very detailed data might not be what you are really looking for, and you better off with a model at a higher level which works basically. And then of course, ideally, you would like to have everything from the atom to the temperature in the room, but sometimes maybe working at intermediate scales is the right tool, in fact.
This is actually another one for you, Alain, since you're already warmed up now. So I mean, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit of conversation that I had with Victor earlier, essentially saying that dynamical functional connectivity approaches are potentially a lot more promising as biomarkers than static functional connectivity approaches. And in that sense, it's a bit interesting to think about why there are so few applications of temporal networks to these same kind of clinical data sets. And I'm not sure to what extent you are familiar with the current approaches in terms of studying dynamical functional connectivity, but how do you think that approaches from temporal networks would potentially complement these, or would it be like a very different way of looking at the same problem altogether?
That's a very interesting question. I would say it's very open, because one thing that, I mean, from what I know, the network approaches have been brought to neuroscience, and now in these years, basically also temporal networks, which have been developed more in around communication networks, social networks, etc. Some tools are being tried to neuroscience. However, and I come back to something that Victor was saying before, also in networks, a lot of what has been done in temporal networks, we talk about temporal networks, but we haven't really managed to completely think and reason temporal. So a lot is basically like snapshots of static networks, and then you apply the usual framework. So moving to really temporal thinking is pretty difficult, and devising tools that are specifically temporal, there are not so many. So in fact, it is a work in progress, even in network science. Then probably in functional connectivity dynamics, there are a number of specificities that make it not directly applicable. I mean, that makes these tools of temporal networks not directly applicable. That's in fact what we are starting to discuss with Demian Battaglia at INS, and that we hope to work on in the next years. So I think that is indeed very promising, but there is a huge issue, which is exactly the one that Victor was saying before, that we are so much used to think static network that we really have to change our way of thinking.
Yeah, very naive question. Well, perhaps kind of stupid. I'm a physicist, so this is the premise. I mean, I'm kind of bothered, but perhaps it's just an expression of my ignorance. That, I mean, the brain has, I mean, features that are there, I mean, by design, and still, again, perhaps it's just my ignorance speaking, having the impression that those features are either used, either addressed. The first one being, well, in StatMech, statistical mechanics, the field I come from, well, you have systems, they have n components, then you take n to very big, and then you have kind of a characterization of your system in this limit, the limit of being big. But the brain is not this kind of system, it's a finite object, finite in space and also finite in the number of connections and neurons you have inside. So this might be something that it can be a limitation, but also something that can be exploited because, for instance, again, in physics, you have systems that have kind of dynamics, and if they are a particular size, then this size constraints is timescales. So first thing is finite size. And the second thing that kind of bothers me, and I don't know if it's meaningful or just kind of, you know, physical reminiscence, is that we have been talking about networks that are mainly functional, so abstract networks, and then the connect term, which is kind of physical network, and this physical network as a kind of spatial structure. So in network science, there's also the other side of the moon, which is spatial networks. Networks that grow constrained by the fact that you are in a 2D, 3D, or you have some kind of spatial constraints like cost. So I want to make a road, and this road, the longer the road, the cost increases. And so this is also meaningful for the kind of criticality and all these kind of discussions, because if you have something that has kind of a dimension, either 3D, either 2D, either in the middle, you know, all the fractal things, this kind of topological information has an impact on also the way you then have, you know, StatMech inside, et cetera, et cetera. This is from physics. In the brain, you also have this kind of structure, which is spatial. So the finite size and the spatial aspect. And again, what bothers me, perhaps ignorance, is that something that is meaningful? Is it something that has been addressed or leveraged or ignored by design because it doesn't matter? Again, naive question, but I mean, for a physicist, it's kind of important. I don't know if you have a stand on that.
So who wants to take that one?
I mean, perhaps it's super stupid what I asked. It's just that your opinion of that.
I'm trying to find something that would go with your example of cost when you build a network, etc., and that there are certain cost functions or certain meaningful variables that could be either optimized or that have to be taken into account. Yeah? What?
The delays you are using.
Degrees, now you talk about structural connectivity.
No,
the delays are.
Don't they depend on the...
Yeah, they're not that proxy for that. I mean, the longer the connection,
Yeah.
the bigger the delay. I mean,
Of course, but it was not that trivial, what you were asking about related aspects.
It's a little bit more refined in the sense that
Yeah.
if you have some kind of dimension,
Yeah.
you can also then know, because we talk about universality classes. I mean, there's kind of method, I mean, models, and then, okay, you don't know exactly how it functions, but you have some, you know, benchmarkings that you know that your model belongs to kind of universality class.
Mm-hmm.
Dimension is the first thing you look at for So if you have those models that are plasma post-rate and they don't care about how it really works for real, but you are trying to have a higher perspective and have something that grasps, again, the universality class of your system. I don't know, again, if it does make sense, but it is just my understanding. Then it makes sense to ask yourself what kind of dimension, if a dimension is a meaningful parameter the brain has. And at the same time, this is the stuff my perspective, at the same time, it does have a kind of spatial, dimension, maybe. So there is this dimensional thing that basically comes from stuff, it comes from the spatial aspect. And, I mean, again, for me it looks like might be important to address, but it doesn't seem it's the case. So I was just puzzled if it is discarded or it's not addressed or
No.
because it doesn't make sense at all.
No, two things come to my mind. So you brought up the time delays and the temporal structure of the connectivity being defined as the distribution of the temporal delays over the different links. That is obviously linked to the wire wiring length, yeah. But it's not just the connectivity, the topological property of the connectivity, but also the distribution of the delays. Provide a hint about the synchronizability of certain subnetworks, which means through myelination of fibers, acceleration, you can either you can control the different subnetworks within the overall network, and you can decide which subnetworks are synchronizable or not. Yeah.
According to basically a spatial scale, which is also a time scale.
Which is linked to the temporal scale, and only because these networks oscillate. In absence of oscillations, if you have an activation paradigm, this does not work. Another thing, criticality came up and avalanches, and if you do not think of oscillations, but if you think of propagation and dissipation of energy through the system, then it is also known that avalanches close to criticality are actually optimized in terms of information processing through the network under a paradigm, under an information theoretical paradigm, a la Shannon, for instance. Yeah? There you can demonstrate that the information transmission capacity is maximized in the network, which, if you think about it in a second step, it's actually almost a triviality, because you have the longest propagation path through the systems as you approach the critical point. Yeah. So these are the two things that come to my mind. Maybe others have other ideas. Since you spoke up, Ellen, I identify you.
I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm not really the right guy. Not really.
You more specifically on networks, if you prefer.
Yeah, no. For networks, most has been done without taking into account spatial constraints, except in the field of urban networks, etc. Because the point has been to compare to random graphs, which are basically mean field, and to find differences with mean field. And the only point that is close to that is maybe the role of communities, which you could say that it means they are close together, etc. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's underdeveloped, obviously, network here, you say. It's not like we know a lot and then it's not used in neuroscience, of course.
But with what happens right now, so with the newest methods for estimating structural connectivity, you have the option of normalizing the connectivity between two regions by the length of the fibers connecting the two regions. So which means that your final structural connectum would be a weighted measure on the length of the connection. So you would have the length into account, which you can of course relate to delays. Or you can also get that value out and perhaps include in the model itself. The value of the delay might be just proportional to the length, since we're not able to measure myelinization with DTI, at least with the techniques we're using right now. then you could at least use the length of the fiber as a measure of delay, perhaps.
Yeah, so I think an important point that was brought up several times, that there's a lack of the right language, basically, to talk about the brain function, basically, or about the temporality that you can have in any system that you can model as networks, as Alan and Victor have said. Like we are lacking maybe also the intuition to capture these complexities of the system. So maybe one question is more methodological, like before starting to tackle like big questions, like what would be the sort of next methodological steps or objects that you think would be needed to address those questions, and what do we need to understand about the system, and how can we sort of try and design the right tools to attack this problem?
Perhaps you have the answer, actually.
No, I wish I had. I wish I had, but
You're
it's
ready to find one.
So which is the temporality of the system, so we spoke about. So I don't have the answer to Paul's question, but I have a related question that is maybe like a bit more specific. So I think, like, at least very kind of direct question, this is mostly for the people who use neuroimaging, I guess, in their own work, is do you think that we can reach clinically useful outcomes with the current, in terms of, diagnosing a disease like schizophrenia, bipolar disease, etc., through some kind of analysis or modeling that's based upon neuroimaging data, without improving upon the current data acquisition methods? So without developing more powerful scanners, either in terms of their spatial or temporal resolution.
Yes, and it is ongoing. And actually, can current scanners and scanning methods offer sufficiently interesting information, probably structural information, but maybe also functional information, in order to constrain the networks better to gain some clinical value in terms of diagnosis and then guidance for treatment and management of certain diseases.
So not just kind of general scientific knowledge, but really to say we can diagnose you with this through this modality and this analysis.
Yeah. From our home, we are doing this already for epilepsy, where we are informing the model. So if you have, for instance, a lesion in epileptic patients, a discharging lesion, and you see it in the structural images, this is nowadays the best predictor for the epileptogenic zone, which is a target for a surgical resection. However, if the lesion is not obvious or distributed, then it's becoming less obvious, and a large percentage of all patients is MRI negative. There you see absolutely nothing in there, yeah, and there people have had hope for DTI, for instance, and DTI analysis has not helped at all there so far for the diagnosis of epilepsy patients. However, this is changing right now when you take the connectivity, the DTI, put it into context of models together. Yeah, from the modeling perspective, there is a predictive value for the propagation, and this helps in the identification of the epileptogenic zone. There, small-scale clinical studies have demonstrated that already. So this exists. There is, and this is an additional constraint imposed upon the networks. But you can go further now. Psychiatry is difficult, but other aspects where there is some information in there. An example that has not been tackled yet, but one could easily envision, following the same paradigm, is take multiple sclerosis. Yeah? Multiple sclerosis, you have a degradation of the myelin pattern. Yeah? Degradation of myelin pattern results in larger time delays, which means changes in the synchronization properties of the individual networks, which explains a large variability of the clinical symptoms of patients depending on where their individual lesions are. But you cannot go down there and do phrenology and say again, if you have this lesion here, there, and there, then you will have this set of appropriate problems. Why not? Because these lesions are in the white matter typically, which means they result in communication problems, which are distributed, communication in terms of signal communication problems. So it's very difficult to interpret this. A phrenological approach will not be viable, and has not been viable so far. This would be a place where you can then take it, put it into a modeling context, test it causally, pose your hypothesis, and start attacking it with the types of methods we have discussed today. And again, these are additional constraints posed upon the networks. And now you can carry this further and further. Stroke, TBI, etc. Psychiatry, it becomes more difficult. Attempts have been made in terms of schizophrenia, the disconnection syndrome, yeah, which already implies what type of attempts have been made. There it's more difficult because neuroimaging, structural neuroimaging does not inform, or to a lesser degree, that is less obvious to translate. But the answer is yes, this is actually an emerging field, and it's extremely hot subject and very exciting.
I mean, the issue of diagnosis from a neuroimaging standpoint is complicated, especially when you move from very obvious clinical syndromes such as multiple sclerosis, where you can see the lesions in a T2 image very, very easily, or traumatic brain injury, where you can see Coup-Contrecoup injury and white matter decline with more exciting modalities. And I would agree that there's been remarkably little advance in the psychiatric perspective. But I think the reason why that is because we may have a too limited idea about what it means to diagnose something. In reality, when we talk about traumatic brain injury, you either did get a bonk on the head or you didn't get a bonk on the head. And one of the often criticized views of why bother using all of these complicated imaging methods to diagnose whether somebody's had a bonk on the head when you could just ask them is ever prevalent here. The actual diagnosis question is less about saying, do you have a syndrome, more, will you have this behavioral outcome? So from the psychiatric effect, saying yes, you're schizophrenic or not, I don't think is the interesting question. The interesting question really is, can you use imaging methods or generative models, and we're talking about taking imaging approaches, pushing them through generative models, to generate some idea, some dynamic idea about how a behavioral outcome will change, and then you could pile those many different possibly orthogonal measures on top of each other and say, okay, that's schizophrenia, or say, oh, that's autism. But my feeling is that the future in this stuff is actually more about personalized medicine in the sense of looking for specific behavioral outcome rather than necessarily diagnosis. And that gets back to that same issue of why bother doing an experiment that separates a bunch of schizophrenic patients from a bunch of health control patients, because you knew before you stuck them in the scanner which ones were schizophrenic and which ones were healthy controls. It doesn't teach you an awful lot unless there's something hidden within that computational model, but that's notoriously difficult. But I think going back to the kind of question that Paul was asking, in a sense of, do these kind of dynamic measures get you further forwards? My feeling is they probably do, but the worry that I have kind of matches kind of Victor's concern of, I don't think we have the appropriate philosophical synthesis at the moment for talking about these kind of dynamical measures without relaying back to our eons old and slightly comfortable way of making things static and making dynamic things feel static. The true answer is in some kind of four-dimensional problem that is very difficult to even tangibly visualize, let alone come up with. There's a philosophy missing there somewhere, and there's a complicated collection of statistics that don't exist in that space, which is probably where all of this kind of rich temporal information lives.
So I definitely agree with this idea that, you know, putting a bunch of people with schizophrenia in a scanner and a matched control group is quite limiting, and that, you know, these people obviously have a specific behavioral deficits, and I agree with you that it's more about the specific behaviors or behavior of a given individual as opposed to the diagnosis itself. The only thing that I would maybe add to that is that the diagnosis can be stratified, perhaps, right? So you can think of schizophrenia as you know, having potentially multiple different neurobiological substrates, and perhaps that a given patient, you know, should be treated according to whatever specific neurobiological correlates there are for their symptoms. So in that sense, I'm not sure if that still falls into the diagnosis side of things, but I think like stratification of the diagnosis is possibly something that can be achieved through these models, hopefully.
Yeah, I agree. I think the stratification question is very much important. If you take a clinical population such as schizophrenia, for example, or even actually probably depression is a more interesting case in this sense. You have patients who are highly refractive to standard first-line treatments. You have patients that are highly refractive to SSRIs. Then the second line would be you try SNRIs. SNRIs don't work. Then you try MOIs, and they don't work. And then you have a collection of talking therapies, some of which work, some of which don't work, which statistically, in a kind of complicated way, has traditionally shown that antidepressants are not a great deal better than placebo on a group level, and of course that's not necessarily true. We all are aware of people whose lives have been tremendously benefited by taking antidepressants, but it's not a clinically straightforward forward diagnosis. And the same is true of schizophrenia, the same is true with autism, and this is true in the whole mental health realm. In reality, which separates it from what I would call the physical disorders, which are stroke, trauma, and things like MS, which have or Alzheimer's disease, and breaks them down into a kind of complicated set of syndromes that really do need stratifying. And I think one of the advantages of using these kind of computational approaches is that with the correct philosophy and the correct tools behind it, you could generally say, this is a person who we clinically would say was depressed, these are the tools that are open to us. Take a collection of stratified imaging, push it through a collection of biophysical models of some description, run those forward models, and have a good prediction about, well, there's absolutely no point in making you sit on quetiapine for 6 months because it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. But what would really help is if you do, this terribly expensive focused talking therapy, because we know that people that have the temporal signatures that you have within your brain, or the particular mix of kind of complicated behavioral pathologies that we can predict from the imaging, tend to do better. But if I was to mix you in with a bunch of other people, we would probably find it very difficult to detect that there's anything wrong with you in the first place.
There's something we seem to be forgetting, I think, from my, again, very naive point of view, and that is that we don't all have the luxury of victors to have the ability to actually place electrodes down into the brain. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things that are really difficult. If you're thinking about, for instance, doing a single subject, I mean, that would, if we wanted to help somebody, we would have to be able to do this on a single subject level. To my knowledge, you cannot even do ERP, solid ERP studies, mismatch negativity or whatever on single subjects levels. I mean, in some cases you can, but in some cases you don't get anything but noise. I mean, next thing, if you want to have the temporal resolution of that you need EEG or MEG, you won't get. It's difficult to measure the deeper structures in the brain, let alone the fact that you actually also want to measure dopamine, endorphin, whatever in the brain in order to get the full picture. So the original question was, do you think that we can advance this field without having new technologies? I don't think so. I think we need that there's really something here where we need some new technologies that can actually both have temporal and spatial resolution and a noise, signal to noise ratio that is better than EEG, for instance. So I can understand all these ideas, but I think there's some engineers that have to get to work also.
Well, yeah, thank you for this very interesting discussion. And unfortunately, I think we're reaching our cut-off time. But I think we would be more than happy to continue discussing maybe with a drink or something, because it's been a very long and dry day. So yeah, maybe Sarah, you have, and didn't you say we have somewhere to go maybe?
Or we can find a bar.
I'm sure that's not the biggest problem we have to address today, probably. So yeah, I would again thank all the speakers for a very stimulating day that showed that the field or the fields are very active. There are very interesting questions, and so there's still work to do, and interesting work that is probably very translational, and that can yield really translational tools and answer really deep questions. And yes, so let's thank the speaker again and the audience. And yeah, so thank you all. In case we are still the 5 of us who are staying for a whole month in Marseille from now, so if you want to interact with us, or we might actually contact you for meetings or talks or drinks. Well, anyway, thanks all.
Also, it always takes lots of work and effort to put a meeting together like this. Yeah? Even though it was a small meeting, it is the same amount of work. Thank you very much, Paul, Sarah, everyone who was involved of the organizers. It was stimulating. Thank you.